Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today we are going to be talking about the top 5 smartest fantasy characters that I have read to date. I love reading about characters who are extremely intelligent. They're miles ahead of everybody else. They're the person who's kind of moving the chess pieces. I get so much satisfaction out of reading those types of characters because not that I'm saying I'm like super intelligent or anything, but I can relate to those characters more than any other type of character. I get an immense amount of satisfaction when I read a character who's incredibly intelligent, executed incredibly well. And so without further ado, we're going to jump into 2 honorable mentions, and then I've got my top 5. So for my 2 honorable mentions, we've got the first one, which is Kaz Brekker from the Six of Crows duology by Leigh Bardugo. Kaz Brekker, no matter what you think about, Six of Crows and Leigh Bardugo and, YA fantasy and whatever, Kaz Brekker is a very intelligent character. He's the person that everybody respects. He's the person that everybody goes to when things go wrong. He is the one that is masterminding all of the little pieces. And he is, arguably the only person who has the full picture. And I really like it when you have a character who is somewhat morally grey. I mean, you'll notice a theme, actually. Most of the characters on this list are morally grey. And we'll get into that in a second. But Kaz is a very morally grey character, right? Like, he does certain things and you're wondering whether he's doing it because he genuinely cares or because he's doing it because it's best for him and the situation. Knowing what we know of Kaz, assuming you've read the books, there's this really interesting thing about his personality that I really identify with. And it's this sense of feeling like you're alone, but actually having really good people around you who you can depend on if you needed to. Not that you need to, but if you needed to, if you wanted to, you could. Seeing Kaz's evolution of being this quite ruthless, quite cold-hearted person in book 1, and then in book 2, you start to see some of those boundaries, not all of them, but some of those boundaries start to come down for certain people. It's really satisfying to watch because it shows that you can be intelligent, you can be powerful, you can be, essentially the mastermind, but not necessarily at the cost of your own, not identity, but not at the cost of your own kind of self-worth, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's the right word that I'm trying to use, but I really like that Kaz's character really develops and that he opens himself up to other characters in the narrative, because I feel like he would have been really one-dimensional, but he isn't. I actually think Kaz is a very complicated character, and I really like that. The second character is Marasi from the Mistborn Era 2 series by Brandon Sanderson. Don't know if I'm saying her name right, but I really enjoyed her character. She is a woman in a man's world, and she is navigating some really difficult situations with very little support from people around her. And she's always able to figure her way out of the situation. I like it when characters can be really resourceful and they utilize the things that are around them to elevate themselves to a position of power or control or whatever. And I think she is a really good example of a character who has to make do with what she has, but she does a really job of making do with what she has. And I think her development is really good as well. She starts off in the first book where she is, in awe of some of the other characters and doesn't feel like she's good enough or doesn't deserve to be there. And then in the second book, we see her get more confident. And then in the third book, she's just like incredibly independent, incredibly self-sufficient young woman. And I identified with her a little bit. And I think Brandon Sanderson wrote a really strong, interesting, complex female character that we don't always see in fantasy. And I think she is a really good example of that. It's definitely Marasi. Now we're going to start with the top 5 characters that I have read so far today that are just exceptional characters, right? They're smart, they're intelligent, they're not perfect, they have flaws, but they make decisions that not every single person could. A, because they just think in that way, and B, because generally, bar one character, I would say on this list, they are very morally grey and they have to make hard decisions that the average person would not be able to make. And they have to do it at the cost of certain things. And I really like characters who do that. In 5th place, we have, there are actually 2 characters, but I'm lumping them together. We have Victor Vale and Eli Cardale from the Villains series, the first book being Vicious, the second book being Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. I had really little expectation going into this book, into this duology. I had very little expectation going into this duology, but I loved this series. I was hooked. I think I read both books in like 2 or 3 days. It's insane. I really like the fact that you have these two young men. You have two parallel timelines in the first book and in the second book, if I remember correctly, but you have these two young men that you're following. They are interested in these kind of extraordinary humans. They call them EOs. And these are people who, when they have a near life death experience, well, they actually die, right? And then they are able to kind of kickstart their heart again. They are then blessed or cursed, depending how you look at it, with magical powers or super kind of powers. And Victor and Eli are really interesting characters. They are very reminiscent of kind of Professor X and Magneto. Victor is very much akin to Magneto. Eli is very much akin to Professor X. You kind of have two battles. You have a micro battle, which is between them two as friends, or, you know, at the time they were friends. And then you have this macro battle of just like good versus evil, what is right, what is wrong. And then you have one person on one side and one person on the other side, but you can't help but feel for both. And I definitely felt Victor is kind of the enemy of the story. He's the villain of the story. But it's interesting because a lot of the stuff that he says, I actually agree with. His way of doing it, I probably disagree with. But I actually would probably side on the side of Victor. I think when you have that dichotomy between two characters who, you know, kind of love each other because they were best friends and they loved each other like brothers, and then seeing them go through that unfortunate breakup, I guess. I don't know why I'm saying this in like romantic relationship terms, but when you see them kind of break up, it's really sad, and you can't help but feel that because of the fact that they broke their friendship, that also has an impact on each of their, you know, outlook on life. And I just think they're a really good pairing, and I think V.E. Schwab did a really good job of characterizing them both and making it really believable. I think they're both quite believable characters, Victor and Eli, but as you can tell, my bias is more towards Victor. I really enjoyed his character a lot. There's just so much complexity there, and I think she captures it really well. So in 5th place, we have Victor Vale and Eli Cardale. In 4th place, and this is mainly, the reason why this character is in 4th place is because I haven't read all the books in the series, so I don't feel like I can bump him up more. And that is Tyrion Lannister, who is in the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin. I've read the first 3 books, I really enjoyed them, and then I started watching the series, and then I just stopped reading the books, not because the books were bad, just because I started watching the series, and I didn't want to consume them both at the same time. Tyrion, he is... you could do a whole like hour-long video, even longer, on Tyrion. Tyrion is such a complex character. He is a dwarf, he is treated like second-class citizen by his own family. He is an outcast. People respect him, but then they're kind of disgusted by him. And it's just this really interesting dynamic that he has with every single character in the book. The kind of people that you would traditionally see as like villains, like his family, look down on him, but then the people who maybe represent good, and more traditionally the kind of good side of the battle, really kind of listen to him and respect him and think of him as an equal, even though he is a dwarf. As I'm sure many of you know, being a dwarf in this setting is really looked down upon, and he is treated very badly because of that. And it's really unfortunate because he is one of the best minds, one of the quickest minds that you will read, based on what I've read anyway. I think Tyrion's character was also done extremely well in the show. I think Peter Dinklage did a phenomenal job of capturing the essence of Tyrion. He's just such a... I find Tyrion a really likable character. He gives off this impression that he doesn't care about how he's treated, but obviously it really has an impact on him. And he's just really likable. Again, I identify with him in certain ways. And he's just this black sheep who is incredibly good at playing people. He's really good at playing people against each other. It's not always done maliciously. I think it's sometimes done at the greater good of the situation. He's able to get buy-in from some of these really strong characters as well, right? You have like Daenerys, Jon Snow. He's able to get validated, not that he needs validation, but he gets validated by some of these really larger than life characters who really carried the show. And I think Tyrion himself, he is probably one of, if not the most important character in the show, at least based on the show. I don't know about the books because I haven't read the rest of the books, but I think in the show as well, like I think he is the one that kind of carries a lot of the main story points. He's so good. He has some of the best lines as well. Anyway, Tyrion Lannister in 4th place. In 3rd place, we have Hermione Granger from the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. Hermione is a kindred spirit in so many ways. When I was reading Harry Potter, I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't the teacher's pet, but I was a hard worker. I think the thing that is most similar between Hermione and I is her love of books. As you will all know, I love books. We all love books. That's why we're here. That's why you're probably watching this video. Her love of books, her insatiable curiosity is something that I 1000% can identify with. I love reading, whatever it is. I love learning new things. I love being able to share that information if people are interested in learning about that information and talking about it and really thinking about the implications of it. And Hermione to me is that, like, she can be a little bit annoying, I'm not gonna lie sometimes. She's a little bit of a know-it-all. I don't think I'm a know-it-all, but I do really like just learning things from people, from books, from situations that I find myself in. And that's why she's a kindred spirit. I think Hermione is exactly the same. And hands down, if Harry and Ron didn't have Hermione, they would have died in like the first book. She is the person that gets them out of really crap situations. And I don't think she gets enough credit for that, to be honest with you. I think Hermione is like vastly underappreciated. They would not have been able to do what they were able to do without her. Whereas like you could remove Ron and you probably would have been able to. Harry, obviously, you can't remove him because he is the main character. But even then, you know, I feel like Hermione could have done stuff without him. So there we go. We've got Hermione Granger in third place. In second place, so second and first, these two are pretty interchangeable. Yeah, I'm going to stick with the order that I put. So in second place, we have Basso from The Folding Knife by KJ Parker. I did a review of this book and I talk a lot about Basso in that review. So I'll link it down below if you're interested in watching it. Basso, I probably identify with Basso most on this list. He is a businessman. He's quite entrepreneurial. He is very good at playing the system. And not that, by the way, when I say that I identify with him, I don't necessarily mean in these ways. I don't play the system, just to be clear. God, it's gonna make me sound like really shady, but I don't mean it in that way. It's just more the way that he thinks about things, the way that he is able to connect certain dots that most people can't, the way that he's able to move chess pieces around the board. And he's just 100 steps ahead of everybody else. Again, he has this kind of insatiable curiosity and, you know, people really respect him. Even if they don't necessarily like him, they respect him. They respect his opinion, what he says, what he does. And I really like it when a character, even though you might not necessarily like them, you can still buy into what they're saying because they're so good at what they do and because you trust what they're saying, because you know that they're thinking about it in ways that you wouldn't be able to. That's what I really like about Basso, is that he's just so switched on. So switched on. I would actually love to see a conversation between him and the first person that I'm going to mention, which some of you have probably guessed by now, because I think it would be such an interesting conversation between these two characters. And I think Basso is just so well executed. There's nothing about his character that I would change. The other thing I really like Basso is that he does have this self-sacrificing aspect. He often talks about how in order for there to be good in the empire, he has to be bad. He has to be the one that makes the really difficult decisions that the populace might not like, because they have to be made. They have to be made in order to usher in a new era, which would lend itself to somebody who is kinder, who can make certain decisions, but not necessarily the really tough ones. His character is so complex because you can't help but sometimes think that he is the villain. And a lot of people would say that he is, but I don't think he is. I think you get these little nuggets of information about him. You see things from his perspective and you're like, he's doing this in some ways because he kind of has to. He wants there to be good in the world, but in order for that to be there, he has to do what he has to do to get there. That whole concept is super interesting to me. And the fact that someone can be so self-sacrificing is really quite incredible. And I think about it a lot. Basso, I still think about him. I read this book 2 months ago and I still think about his character, which is crazy to me. That's never happened before. And apart from maybe with some of Joe Abercrombie's characters, but just phenomenally written. And if you want to read a book about a character who will kind of make you feel very conflicted about him, this is the book that you should read. So in second place, we have Basso. In first place, and I have to say this was a really, really, really close one. Really, really close one. We have Glocta from the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. Glocta is the character that you expect to hate, but you can't help but love. He's so conflicting as a character. I can't help but feel disgusted by some of the stuff that he says and does. But then I also kind of live for it in a weird way. He's so complicated as well. He's such a complex character. You know, we start off with the First Law trilogy where we learn that he was this very ambitious, very capable, very well-respected soldier, I guess, fighter is probably a better word. But then, you know, through the progression of the trilogy, we realize that he's actually gone through some stuff to end up where he is. And so you can't help but understand why he is the way that he is in the original trilogy because of what he went through before the original trilogy starts, which we learn about in the first book. And you also get more context on it in Sharp Ends, the short story collection. I think Glocta is, you can't help but love him. His inner monologues are phenomenal. I've never read a character that is so different to me in so many different ways, but is so relatable as well. The Glocta is very relatable to me. I think his little inner monologues about like incompetency, people just being people, I guess. And sometimes, you know, we can be in our own heads about that. And I think, you know, I can definitely relate. I can definitely relate in certain ways. The thing I like about Glocta as well is that he can meet a person or just even see a person, and he is able to pin that person down so easily. I think I'm quite good at that. And so when he talks about certain characters, I remember there's that like interaction where he first meets Logan, but he sees him at the dinner table. They don't actually speak. He sees him at the dinner table. It's just hilarious, like how he pins down Logan within the space of like a couple of lines. And he does the same to Jazzle. He does the same to Pharaoh. It's just hilarious. It's just absolutely hilarious. He's very judgmental, but you can kind of, I feel like out of all the characters, Glocta is the one that has the most right to be judgmental, given everything that he's been through. And given that, you know, life has maybe not handed him the best deck of cards. But there's just something about him that is just so real. Like Glocta is real to me in some ways. Kind of like Basso as well. Basso feels very real because they're very flawed characters. They're very morally grey characters. You don't necessarily agree with every single thing that they do, especially Glocta, I would argue even more. You don't necessarily agree with everything that he does, but you understand the logic, you understand the rationale as to how he got to that decision, and you can't fault that specific thing in itself. You can fault the actual decision, but you can't fault the logic to get to that decision. And that's what makes it so hard to, like, you know, grapple with the fact that you like this character, but you dislike this character. And it's just really interesting. I think Abercrombie, as you all know, I think Abercrombie does characters the best. And Glocta is one of those characters that you feel really conflicted about because he's had a really tough life in certain regards. But in other regards, he's also just miles ahead of everybody else. He's just so smart, so intelligent, and like so capable. And you kind of I definitely rooted for Glocta a lot. And I love that ending in Last Argument of Kings where you're like, yes, this is the ending that this character deserved. I think Glocta is just phenomenal. He's just phenomenally written. He's so easy to identify with. I think everybody identifies with him in some way, shape or form. He's a character that I identify a lot with personally, even though I don't necessarily agree with some of the decisions that he makes. I agree with the logic by which he gets to making those decisions and those plans and moving those pieces. And so Glocta has to take the first spot. I mean, like I said, it was very close between Glocta and Basso. I was umming and ahhing about it. And as I've been talking about it, I do think Glocta does take the first spot because there's just something about him that he's just so different to my own lived experience, and yet I find him so relatable. It's just that's so unique. Whereas like Basso, I think there's similarities between Basso and me. There aren't that many similarities like physically or experiences lived between Glocta and I, and yet I still identify with him so much. I love that he's able to just pin people down and just able to walk into a room and see what's going on before everybody else, and is able to pick out the key players. And you know, he gets what he gets because he's good at it, and I love it. I love the character that has arguably been through some of the toughest stuff. And I don't know, I think people will disagree with me on that, but I do think Glocta has been through probably more stuff than most in the series. He's the one that kind of comes out on top in certain ways. And I love that. I love it when a character, that's also why I love Tyrion's character, right? I love it when a character who is so obviously disadvantaged, maybe physically, is able to then make up for that intellectually and is miles ahead of everybody else. So definitely Glocta takes the first spot. So there we have it. We have our top 5 smartest fantasy characters that I've read to date. I'm very curious whether you guys agree with this, and if there are any characters that you've read that I may not have read, and what you think about them and whether you think they deserve a place on this list, because I'm actually looking for more books that I can read with really smart characters, because I just love reading it. It's something that gives me life. So let me know down below if there are any books that you've read that have really, really, like a really smart protagonist or really smart characters in general. And I'll definitely look into it, because I think it's my favorite type of character. I think my favorite type of character is the really smart, intelligent one who's just miles ahead of everybody else. So let me know down below. We'll take the conversation in the comments. And otherwise, I had really fun actually thinking about who I would put on this list. There were some really obvious ones for me, and then there were some other ones that I was thinking a little bit more about, but I think it's a solid list and I stand by it. So with that in mind, I will speak to you all in the next video. As always, stay safe, take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.